Welcome to the second video in this two-part series on elasticity. In part one, we covered the basic concept of elasticity and learned that elasticity refers to the sensitivity of the relationship between two variables. How responsive is the dependent variable to changes in the independent variable? The more responsive, the more elastic is the relationship. The less responsive, the more inelastic. In part one, we applied it specifically to the price elasticity of demand, the sensitivity of quantity demanded to changes in price. In this session, we want to cover three other types of elasticities: the price elasticity of supply, the cross-price elasticity of demand, and the income elasticity of demand. Let's start with the price elasticity of supply. Here's the definition. You could have probably defined it on your own. The sensitivity of the relationship between the price of a good and the resulting quantity supplied. In other words, how responsive will producers of a certain good be to changes in the price that consumers are willing to pay for it? If consumers are, for some reason, willing to pay a little more for it, will firms respond by flooding the market with tons and tons of the good? Or, if the market price of the product goes down, will firms shut down, bail out of the market, shift to the production of other goods, and otherwise dramatically cut back on its production? If so, the relationship is elastic. If, however, a relatively large price change barely affects the firm's output decisions, the relationship would be inelastic. Look at these two curves. Give it a moment and see if you can identify the more elastic supply curve. Okay, time's up. As it turns out, supply curve A is the more elastic supply curve. That's because a relatively small change in price results in a relatively large change in quantity supplied. On the other hand, supply curve B is less elastic, or more inelastic. A large change in price produces a relatively small change in quantity supplied. As with the demand curve, the flatter of the two supply curves is the more elastic. Here's the formula for computing the price elasticity of supply. As you probably could have guessed, it's the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. If the relationship is greater than 1, now we don't have to be taking absolute values of these figures. Owing to the direct relationship between price and quantity supplied, all of these values will already be positive. So, if the ratio is greater than 1, the supply will be elastic. That's because the percentage change in quantity will be greater than the percentage change in price. By the same reasoning, if it's less than 1, the supply will be inelastic. By the same reasoning, if it's less than 1, the supply will be inelastic. Now let's consider the determinants of price elasticity of supply. These are factors that will affect how responsive a firm can be to fluctuations in the market price of a product. The first of these would be the availability of resources. A firm would have a difficult time increasing its output in response to a price increase if it can't obtain the resources it requires to produce the product. A couple of decades ago, there was a strike overseas by factory workers in textile mills. Screen printing companies were having a difficult time obtaining blank t-shirts. At one point, they had to order blank t-shirts 6 months in advance. If for some reason the price of screen printed t-shirts went up, the firm would not be able to respond because they'd have to wait 6 months for the blank t-shirts. But if there were no supply chain issues, if they could have blank t-shirts delivered the next day with just a phone call or an email, they could have been much more responsive to changes in price. The supply would have been much more elastic. On the other hand, most of the workers in a screen printing shop had special skills that enabled them to operate the capital equipment required to produce the product. Oftentimes, a screen printing company would provide training for its workers, but it would take weeks before the workers would be able to actually be productive. Workers with those skills were hard to find. Screen printing firms were reluctant to reduce their workforce in the off-season, when the demand and thus the price of t-shirts were down. Thus, they had to continue to maintain their workforce and continue printing t-shirts even when t-shirt prices were low. As a result, they didn't reduce their output very much, if at all, when the price of the product went down. The supply of screen-printed t-shirts, therefore, was very inelastic. We can conclude, therefore, that the more available the resources, the more elastic will be the price elasticity of supply. The less available the resources, the more inelastic. The second determinant of price elasticity of supply would be the substitutability of resources. It stands to reason that if resources are substitutable, labor can be used to replace capital, wood can be used in place of plastic, nylon can be used in place of cotton. The more available the resources will be. And of course, the more available the resources, the more elastic will be the price elasticity of supply. Therefore, we can conclude that the more substitutable the resources, the more elastic the supply will be with respect to price. If screen printing companies had been able to substitute those specialized workers with just any worker off the street, they would not have been as reluctant to cut back on production during the off-season, and the supply of screen printed t-shirts would have been much more elastic. A third determinant of price elasticity of supply would be the shelf life of the item. The term shelf life refers to the product's ability to be stored in a warehouse. The longer it can be stored without depreciation, degradation, spoiling, rotting, or otherwise diminishing its market value, the longer its shelf life. To understand the effect of an item's shelf life on its price elasticity of supply, remember the technical definition of supply. Supply is defined to be the relationship between the price of an item and the resulting amount of that item that firms are willing and able to make available for sale. Recall that we just simplified this phrase and called it quantity supplied. Notice that this definition doesn't say anything about producing the item. It's all about making it available for sale. So, if a firm produces an item and puts it in its warehouse, it's not making it available for sale, and therefore is not being supplied. By the same token, a firm can supply an item in a particular period without having produced it in that period, simply by taking previously produced items out of the warehouse and making them available for sale. If a good is storable in a warehouse, a firm does not have to disrupt its operations to respond, say, to a price decrease. It can continue operating its capital, keep its workforce, and simply ship the items to the warehouse rather than the store shelves. It's simply a logistical decision. It's no big deal. Or, in the case of a price increase, a firm can respond without having to build new factory space, purchase and install more capital equipment, and hire more workers. It can increase the quantity it supplies simply by taking previously produced products right out of the warehouse and making them available for sale. In the absence of a warehouse, or if the product can't be stored for very long because it has a short shelf life, like, say, milk, the decision to increase or decrease quantity supplied in response to a change in price is a big deal. Therefore, we can conclude the longer the shelf life of an item, or the easier it is to store it, the more elastic will be the supply. A fourth determinant of the price elasticity of supply is the ease with which fluctuations in the price of the product can be predicted. Obviously, if the changes in the price of a product can be accurately predicted, this will give the firm an opportunity to prepare for those changes. For example, if the product price fluctuates seasonally, as in the case of screen-printed t-shirts, the firm can spend the entire off-season preparing for the increase in demand that is to come. However, if changes in product price are random, they fluctuate frequently and irregularly, or can significantly change overnight, the firm might be caught off guard and not be able to respond very quickly. So, the easier it is to accurately predict price changes, and I might also add, the longer the lead time the predictions provide, the more elastic will be the supply of the item in respect to price. And finally, as with the price elasticity of demand, time also has an impact on the elasticity of supply. Like demand, every supply relationship has a time frame. The supply is the relationship between the price of an item and the resulting quantity supplied over a period of 1 week, a period of 1 year, or some other time period. The longer the time frame of a specific supply relationship, the greater opportunity firms will have to respond to price changes. The relationship between the price of, say, widgets and the resulting quantity that will be supplied over a period of 1 year will be more elastic than that same relationship over a period of 1 week. The longer the time frame, ceteris paribus, the more elastic will be the supply of an item with respect to its price. There are quite a few applications for the price elasticity of supply, especially when combined with the price elasticity of demand, one of which is to determine the incidence of a tax. The incidence of a tax refers to the burden of a tax. Turns out, the party upon whom the tax is placed might not be the party who actually bears the burden of the tax. Although he may be the tax collector, he may be able to force the counterparty to pay the tax. So for any given tax, who will actually pay it? What is the incidence of the tax? Upon whom does the burden fall? The party upon whom the tax is placed? The counterparty? Or do they share the burden of the tax? And if so, to what extent? This all depends, as you might have guessed, on the price elasticity of demand relative to the price elasticity of supply. A link to a video applying the concepts of price elasticities of demand and supply to determine the incidence of a tax is in the description box below. Also in the to-do list of Module 4. But now let's turn our attention to another kind of elasticity. This one will be the cross-price elasticity of demand. We know that the price elasticity of demand is the sensitivity of the quantity of a particular good demanded to changes in its price. As you can see here, the formula is the percent change in the quantity of X demanded divided by the percentage change in the price of X. The subscripts X were absent in the previous video on price elasticity of demand because it was taken for granted that the price and quantity demanded were of the same good. The cross-price elasticity of demand, however, refers to the sensitivity of the quantity of good X demanded to the changes in the price of good Y. If these two goods are unrelated, then a change in the price of Y is going to have no impact whatsoever on the quantity of X demanded, and therefore the coefficient of cross-price elasticity of demand would be zero. What do you suppose would be the coefficient of cross-price elasticity of demand, expressing the sensitivity of the relationship between the price of coffee and the quantity of shoes demanded? Obviously, these two products have virtually nothing to do with each other. The price of, say, coffee, we'll let that be good Y, could change by a huge amount, but the quantity of shoes demanded wouldn't even budge. The denominator in this ratio could be a huge number, but the numerator would be zero because the two goods are unrelated. This would produce a coefficient of zero. If consumers considered good X a substitute for good Y, then an increase in the price of Y would cause people to buy X in its place. The increase in the price of Y would cause an increase in the quantity of X demanded. This direct relationship between the price of Y and the quantity demanded of X would cause the coefficient to be positive, greater than zero. If the price of Y went down, people would leave the X market to buy more Y. The relationship would still be direct. The price of Y goes down, the quantity of X demanded goes down. This direct relationship would cause the coefficient to be greater than zero. The greater the value of the coefficient, the closer would be the substitutability of the two products. What would happen to the quantity of mustard demanded if the price of mayonnaise went up? If they're substitutes, people would buy less mayonnaise and buy more mustard in its place. Actually, there might be some degree of substitutability there, but probably not much. You could put both on hamburgers, but not hot dogs. If the price of mayonnaise went up, the quantity of mustard demanded might go up a little bit, but probably not much. The value of both the numerator and the denominator in this ratio would change in the same direction, and thus the coefficient would be positive, greater than zero, but probably less than 1. On the other hand, if the price of Hellmann's mayonnaise went up, what do you suppose would happen to the quantity of Duke's mayonnaise demanded? Some people might be able to tell the difference and would pay a higher price for Hellmann's, but probably a lot of people would switch to Duke's, maybe in droves. Price of Hellmann's goes up, the quantity of Duke's goes up by a lot. The coefficient would likely be a large positive number because of the close degree of substitutability. If, however, these two goods are complements, the coefficient would be negative, less than zero. That's because there would be an inverse relationship between the price of Y and the quantity of X demanded. Complements, remember, are goods that are bought together because one makes the other complete, the root word of complement. If the price of Y went up, people would buy less Y and therefore wouldn't need as much X, and therefore would buy less. The price of Y goes up, the quantity of X demanded goes down, an inverse relationship. Or, if the price of Y goes down, people will buy more Y and therefore will want to buy more X. If the price of Y goes down, quantity of X demanded goes up. An inverse relationship will produce a negative coefficient. A classic textbook example of complements would be pants and belts. Obviously, one good completes the other. But when I go to buy a pair of pants, I probably won't buy a belt to go along with it. I've already got tons of belts in my closet, some dating back to high school. They don't fit anymore, but the point is, that I might buy a pair of pants and a belt to go with it from time to time, but not very often. If the price of pants goes up, people will buy fewer pairs of pants. And while it's within the realm of imagination that the amount of belts purchased would go down, I can't imagine that the two would be very sensitive. The price of pants goes up by a huge amount, hypothetically, the quantity of belts demanded goes down, but probably by a very small amount. Because the two values, the price of pants and the quantity of belts demanded, are moving in the opposite direction, this ratio would then produce a negative number, but it would probably be very small. But what about golf clubs and golf balls? These are two complementary items that, it's my guess, have a very strong relationship. Both are pretty useless without the other. If the price of golf clubs were to rise, the quantity of golf clubs demanded would go down. But because people are being priced out of the golf industry, they'll no longer have any use for golf balls. So the quantity of golf balls demanded will go down. Probably down by a lot, because most golfers will lose a couple hundred golf balls a year. The quantity of tennis balls demanded might go up as a result of the increase in the price of golf clubs. We'd expect that because golf and tennis are substitutes. But because the price of golf clubs and the demand for golf balls will move in opposite directions, the cross-price elasticity of the two would be a negative number. And because they're so closely related, that number would be big. The concept of cross-price elasticity of demand had an important role to play in the history of antitrust policy that was mentioned in the introduction of this module, Module 4, on Canvas. Back in the 1950s, it was used to establish the definition of an industry, and it saved the DuPont Cellophane Corporation from the ravages of the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice. The DuPont Cellophane Corporation was accused of being the only seller in the cellophane industry and thus was an illegal monopolist. While they were indeed the only seller of cellophane, DuPont claimed that there was no such thing as the cellophane industry. The industry, DuPont claimed, should be defined as the flexible container industry, in which DuPont only had a third of the total industry sales, nowhere near a monopoly. The concept of cross-price elasticity was used to show that consumers considered items like wax paper, tinfoil, and other things like that close enough substitutes for them to be considered in the same industry. Their lawyers set some economists to work, and they found that the cross-price elasticity of demand between cellophane and those other flexible containers had a large enough positive coefficient to indicate that they were all close substitutes. We'll refer to this famous landmark case again when we get to Module 10 on antitrust policy. Now, one last type of elasticity that we want to consider is the income elasticity of demand. The term income elasticity of demand is probably self-explanatory. The income elasticity of demand refers to the sensitivity of the quantity of an item purchased to changes in income. If, when income went up, would the amount of a product purchased go way up? In which case the relationship would be elastic. Up just a little? In which case the relationship would be inelastic. Or would the amount of the item purchased go down? That sounds interesting, but if it did, the coefficient of income elasticity of demand would in fact be negative. Pause this video and see if you can jot down on the back of an envelope the formula for computing the coefficient of income elasticity of demand. If your formula looks like this, then you probably understand the concept of elasticity pretty well. The coefficient of income elasticity of demand is the ratio of the percentage change in the quantity of a particular good demanded relative to the percentage change in income. If the ratio is greater than 1, then the quantity of a good demanded will be sensitive to changes in income. Therefore, we call the relationship elastic. In everyday language, if you were to get a raise, the first thing you would do is run out and buy more of this good. However, if your income goes down, this is the first thing you'd cut out of your budget. We'd call such a product a luxury. You buy a lot more when you become richer, but you buy a lot less when you get poorer. If, on the other hand, the ratio has a small positive coefficient, that is, greater than 0 but less than 1, we'd refer to this relationship as inelastic. Once again, in plain English, whether income goes up or down, your consumption of this good isn't going to change very much. You'll buy pretty much the same amount period after period, whether you're becoming richer or poorer. Such a good we'll call a necessity. You need a certain amount of this stuff and you're going to buy it whether you're rich or poor. When you get a raise, do you significantly increase the amount of toothpaste or toilet paper or light bulbs you consume? There might be a slight positive relationship, but it's not very strong. Now, these two categories of goods have something in common. They both have a positive coefficient of income elasticity of demand. That means whether really sensitive or not so sensitive, when income goes one way, the amount of these items consumed goes the same way. Income goes up, purchases of these items go up, and vice versa. These kinds of goods are called normal goods. It's normal to buy more of something when you get richer. But what about those situations where you buy less of something as you get richer? Or you buy more of something as you become poorer? This type of good would have a negative coefficient of income elasticity of demand. When income goes one way, the quantity of such an item demanded goes the other way. This includes things like used clothing, fake designer goods like Rolexes and fake Coach purses, Walmart sneakers, spam, although some people like spam. When your income goes up, you buy less of these things. These goods are called inferior goods, but it doesn't mean they are of inferior quality. Community college education is an inferior good. So are bus rides, store brand goods, although I would stay away from the Tastios. Things you substitute for as you become richer and buy more of as you get poorer. For the very last exercise in this two-part series on elasticities, pause the video and see if you can jot down the graph that shows a luxury, a necessity, and an inferior good. For each of these three graphs, put income on the vertical axis and quantity demanded on the horizontal axis. Okay, ready to see the results? Here's what the function looks like for a luxury. The function is positively sloped and sort of flat. Small changes in income will produce relatively large changes in the quantity of the item demanded. For a necessity, the function would also be positively sloped, but a lot steeper. Relatively large changes in income would produce only relatively small changes in quantity demanded. For an inferior good, though, the function has a negative slope. That is due to the inverse relationship between income and the amount of the good that will be purchased. So, how'd you do? Remember, if you have a question on any aspect of elasticity, whether it's the price elasticity of demand, the price elasticity of supply, the cross-price elasticity of demand, or the income elasticity of demand, post those questions and comments in the discussion session of the class website on Canvas. Don't forget to check out the video applying the concepts of price elasticities of demand and supply to determine the incidence of a tax. There's a link to this video in the description box below and in the to-do list of Module 4.